Well, this seems like a good video to finally do. If there's ever a chance to combine games with an iconic British television series, you know I'll be there sooner or later. And The Crystal Maze was one of my absolute favourite shows as a child, something that had to be watched every week it was on. It's still very fondly remembered, a show that hasn't aged badly at all, and there'll certainly be a bit of a time to reminisce about the original classic one. However, the main subject of this vid probably isn't as well remembered, the games based on the TV show, for there were actually a decent handful of curious presentations indeed. There's a run of free arcade games that you might possibly remember playing, and there's also a rather obscure DOS game. A decent amount of things to get through then, so it's time for us to start running, for no real reason at all, to the first zone, and take a good look back at the show itself. Now, I imagine that for a lot of people watching, The Crystal Maze doesn't need much of an introduction, but it's nice to have a premiere for those who may not be familiar with it. The show ran on Channel 4 from 1990 to 1995, and it's one of the best game shows that the UK has ever produced. The idea for it came after Channel 4 and production company Chatsworth originally wanted to do a version of the French show Fort Boyard, but after a pilot didn't really go to plan, they went back to the drawing board and devised a variation on the format with original Boyard creator and game show genius Jacques Antoine, who'd also designed other popular running about a lot shows like Treasure Hunt and cult classic Interceptor. You have a team of 6 people running about and playing individual games in 4 zones: Aztec, Futuristic, Medieval, and Industrial, which was replaced by the Ocean Zone later on. Contestants can play either a physical, skill, mental, or mystery game, and they can take a lot of forms: shooting down targets, crossing treacherous water-filled pits, lots of sliding block and volume-based puzzles, solving a fortune teller's riddles. There's plenty of good ones. The team wins a crystal for each successful game, which gives them 5 seconds of time in the final game and centrepiece, the Crystal Dome. They cross that bridge over the water, Richard O'Brien shouts, "Will you start the fans, please?" And they have to collect gold tokens as they're blown about while avoiding silver ones. If they end up with 100 gold after the silver ones are deducted, they win, and they get some sort of activity-based prize as a reward, which is nice. I mean, it's hardly Bully's fashion shopping spree, but it makes sense to have an activity as a prize for winning on an activity-based show, even if the activity itself is crap. And if they lose, well, they do at least get a Swarovski crystal with "I cracked the Crystal Maze" engraved on it. The show was brilliant for several reasons. Channel 4 didn't skimp at all on the production, creating a huge and lush set that was probably the biggest in Europe at the time, and spending plenty of money, which absolutely shows in the end product. Like any good game show, it's a great one for shouting at the television. You'll be right there with the team as they try to offer advice to whoever's playing the game, even if they can't actually hear you. The pressures of time and plain old foolishness make for some classic moments of failure, the sort of thing that goes down in infamy. The one who couldn't figure out a basic water puzzle and turning the taps round, the guy who can't see U3 even though it's right in front of his face, that woman who falls spectacularly in the water in the title sequence, and possibly best of all, this one fella who reaches for a reflection of a crystal instead of, the crystal that's actually there. It's amazing how a game show makes people fail at basic human tasks, really. The biggest reason of all, however, was Richard O'Brien. An unconventional game show host for sure, Mr. Rocky Horror Picture Show was the perfect maze master. Playfully malevolent, almost like a Time Lord who'd settled on Earth and got a job on network television, and very much in with the audience with his playful asides and antics to the camera, something that he improvised from the first episode onwards, initially without the knowledge of the production crew. Playing the harmonica, making references to Mumsy, encouraging the team whilst being more realistic about their chances to the viewer. He ended up being the perfect host for this different sort of game show. I mean, let's face it, you could hardly have had Bruce Forsyth hosting the Crystal Maze now, could you? The show appealed to just about everybody. While it was primarily aimed at adults, kids also loved it, and episodes were shown twice a week, with the original slot on Thursdays at 8:30, and a more kid-friendly repeat slot on Sundays at 6 p.m. The success of the show with children also meant that when it came to special holiday editions, Channel 4 chose to run children's specials as opposed to letting D-list celebrities arse about on the set, and they didn't make the games any easier for the kids either. The original run of the show lasted for 6 series and 83 episodes. Not all that long in the grand scheme of game shows. The beginning of the end perhaps came when O'Brien left after the 4th series because he wished to go back to being an actor. While he was replaced by another unconventional host in the shape of Ed Tudor Pole, it wasn't really the same. I don't think Ed did a bad job personally, but he had absolutely impossible shoes to fill. When the show finished, it perhaps could have gone on longer commercially, but really it was stopped before any serious rot occurred, finishing when it wasn't that far removed from its prime. There was a revival in the 2010s, starting with a one-off Stand Up to Cancer special, and continuing on with a full return hosted by Richard Ayoade, which was good and bad. It still had a vibe, and Ayoade was his own sort of maze master, as opposed to a Richard O'Brien imitation, which was good. But it did have too many of the D-list celebrities arsing around, the sort of thing that wouldn't have happened back in the day. This revival's gone now too, but the original still stands as one of the UK's most celebrated game shows, if not one of its most celebrated TV shows, full stop. It was absolutely unmissable television. But are the games equally unmissable? Or should they be automatically locked in and left to rot? Let's have a look at them now. As far as video games go, we have 4 Crystal Maze titles, 3 from the arcade row and 1 from the computer row. All of them are a little unconventional and not the sort of games we usually cover. I am pretty sure that the arcade Crystal Maze games are the first SWP arcades that we've ever covered, meaning that they're skill with prizes games. Yes, if you play this game and you come out victorious, you can actually win some money. There's a £5 jackpot for anyone who can play the title to the end and get enough gold tokens, and all I can say is, good luck, cause boy are you gonna need it. The 3 Crystal Maze arcades were made by Barquest, a UK company from Ashton-under-Lyne that's probably the most famous name in British slot machines, and they came out between 1992 and 1994. All of them are trackball games, and it's only recently that they've been playable on MAME. As detailed by the almighty David Mame Hayes Hayward, long-time MAME developer Ryan the Mogminer Holtz kind of accidentally fixed the Crystal Maze in 2020 while improving the software's Fairlight CMI emulation, landing on a key component that the arcade's board shared. Being a Barquest game, it's kind of an interesting setup. What we have is a PCB that you would usually find in a fruit machine, but it's one in a video board as opposed to reels. Annoyingly, I don't have a proper trackball controller and have to make do with my mouse, and unfortunately this does make some of the games a little bit tricky to play. Things like the ball mazes are hard enough, but they're kind of impossible with a mouse. Anywho, this is a game that you play for 5 minutes, as the attract mode tells you. You go through each of the 4 zones and you pick what sort of game you want to play. I think you usually get around 7 separate mini-games before the dome. There's 2 in most zones, but it seems like you only get 1 in another. The games themselves are fairly self-explanatory, but that doesn't mean they aren't difficult. You get things like word searches and concentration, but you've also got colour matching puzzles, the aforementioned mazes, parts where you have to shoot down the right targets to reach the top, walking in a line and avoiding rocks from the ceiling, and other assorted japes. The time for each game ranges from a minimum of 30 seconds to a maximum of 1.5 minutes, and that tight scale can make just about anything pretty challenging just on its own. The aesthetic is kind of fun. The games are hardly lookers, but you certainly do get a lot of pictures of Richard O'Brien looking very intimidating as he guides you through the zones, and you do get an AY chip version of the iconic Crystal Maze music, Forcefield by Zach Lawrence. There are some games where, relatively speaking, it's a little bit easier to obtain a crystal. Swapping letters around to solve an anagram isn't often too bad a time, and you should be alright at the tile matching games if you're any good at concentration. Some of the others? Well, when the game gives you all of 30 seconds to unlock the doors in a maze to get a crystal, you do wonder if that's even possible at all. Still, the arcade does categorise the games by their difficulty behind the scenes, and that's going to factor into your chance of winning in the dome. If you only succeed in the easier games, then when the tokens get blown up in the air at the end, well, you'll probably see far more silver ones than gold, and you will have absolutely bob-ope, no hope of winning anything at all. If you manage to complete the tougher games, well, you'll actually see more gold tokens, and you might have a prayer. Chances are pretty good that you'll only have 2 or 3 crystals by the time you get to the dome, mind, so you best get hammering the button when you reach that final game. Turns out that winning actual money is hard. Who'd have thought it? A second version of this game would be released in 1993 called The New Crystal Maze, featuring Ocean Zone. There's not a huge amount of difference here. Obviously, you now have the Ocean Zone instead of the Industrial Zone, and you have a few new graphics here and there, but generally speaking, most of the minigames haven't been changed all that much. I think there's a couple of tweaks, but if anything they make the game tougher. It seems like you get a lot less time on average to complete a minigame than you did in the original. Now obviously it would be a bit silly to say that this game's needlessly frustrating or unfair or anything like that. I mean, it's an SWP game after all. Real money's at stake, and of course it's going to be bloody difficult. Anyway, the third and final game from 1994 is a little different. The Crystal Maze Team Challenge does feature a bunch of new minigames, such as top-down mazes and sliding puzzles. Nothing groundbreaking, but it's what you would expect. You also get an actual group to control with cartoon portraits, choosing the game you want by picking them instead of just going for physical or mystery or whatever, and the winning conditions are a little clearer. If you get over 70 gold tokens in the final game, then you can win £5. And as usual, yeah, it's not easy in the slightest. Seeing as Richard O'Brien wasn't hosting the TV show at this point, all of his pictures have been taken out, although sadly there aren't any new pictures of Ed Tudor Pole to replace them, which is a bit of a disappointment. Generally speaking, although there's slight technical improvements to the presentation, the game is mostly the same as the other two, which is what you would expect. The thing with these games is that, much like the show itself, they are really meant to be played with a group. Both the second and third Crystal Maze games allow for a maximum of 4 players to take part. There's other things in common with the show. You do have a big button marked escape that you'll need to press when the time starts to run out, and if you don't you will get locked in, and again, you'll only be brought back if the rest of the team gives up a crystal. The third game's the only one to have automatic locking conditions, although they are pretty easy to avoid. Generally a lock-in will only happen if you run out of bullets in a certain game or something along those lines, so you've just got to be mindful of that. These games aren't necessarily anything special, but I have a soft spot for them, as they do hit quite a specific nostalgia bone, not just one that's connected with the show. I have fond memories of playing one of these Crystal Maze machines, I believe it would have been the third one, back in the mid-90s at the AMF bowling alley on Southend Pier, and I used to have a great time with it, playing with me dad. I mean, it's an arcade game based on the Crystal Maze, so of course I enjoyed it. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1995, that Crystal Maze arcade machine burned down, along with the rest of the bowling alley, in the third big fire on Southend Pier thanks to an electrical fault. Thankfully no one was seriously injured, but the bowling alley was absolutely destroyed. Hell, I think I'd only last been there a couple of weeks or so before it happened. I'd always wanted to have a look at this game again, and had always been disappointed that it wasn't working in MAME, so even if it's not all that much to speak of, I am happy to finally get the chance to see it again after all these years, and very grateful to the MAME devs who are responsible. What about the computer game then? This one's actually not something I was aware of at all until very recently, to be honest. But yes, there was a Crystal Maze computer game, released in 1993 for PC-DOS and the Acorn Archimedes. The game was published by Shurston Software and developed by Digital Jellyfish Design. Two names that probably have you thinking, who the bloody hell are Shurston Software and Digital Jellyfish Design? Well, it appears as though Digital Jellyfish were a small studio based in New Zealand, at least going by their old website address, and Shurston were a UK-based publisher that specialised in educational software, starting out on the BBC Micro back in the early 80s. So again, this isn't something we often cover on the page. The Crystal Maze computer game is actually an edutainment title, and would have mostly been sold to and found in schools. The presence of the game on the highly edu-friendly Acorn Archimedes is certainly another big clue to that effect, and it does indeed appear that the Archimedes version is actually the original one, which makes sense looking at the company's history. Comments by Nick Westgate, one of the game's developers, on the few videos that there are of this title seem to confirm this. The game follows the usual layout of Fins. 4 zones, a couple of timed games in each, Crystal Dome at the end. The contestants this time are represented by some suitably kid-friendly caricatures, and you pick one of them to play a game. These characters do have strengths and weaknesses, although there's no real way to judge what those are beyond playing the various games with them. The range of games is about the same as what you get in the arcade series. All the physical games are basic platformer affairs. You get sliding puzzles and concentration, you have to click on the appropriate items in the mystery games, and so on. A couple of the games are a bit more familiar. You shoot targets down in the medieval zone, you roll balls down the chute to try and shut up the Aztec statues, and you might get the odd game of Snake or finding the sequence to turn off the lights in the futuristic zone. But not enough of these games, for me, are hugely faithful to what you would see on the show. I suppose you could say the same thing for a lot of the games in the arcade, although it's perhaps a bit more disappointing here. Another thing that's just not faithful to the show at all is the aesthetic. It's a bit of a shame that it just barely tries to recreate that much of anything when it comes to the show's look. You only get a few pictures and generic sound effects, and it does all look a bit like it was done on the cheap. The whole thing has this very low resolution, washed out look that's not aged well at all, and it makes those picture-based mystery games particularly annoying. The only character who might be in any way familiar is a recreation of Mumsy, appearing in the medieval zone to ask you a couple of questions. Neither Richard O'Brien nor Ed Tudor Pole can be found here, presumably because the publishers weren't able to get rights to their likenesses. That and... oh boy, playing this can be annoying. Good lord are some of these games hard. Some of that's down to some kind of ropey controls, particularly in the platform stages, but others like the target games are just plain irritating and obtuse. You may want to get familiar with the escape command if you don't want everyone to get trapped, although said command is control and escape. Now obviously this isn't actually a fault of the game, but that command might be a bit of a bother if you're playing this in DOSBox, as you might just end up opening the start menu. You can adjust the difficulty quite extensively with a slider, and there is also a practice mode where you can play the games as much as you want without fear of getting trapped. Surprisingly enough, for a game that's edutainment, you may well need to take advantage of these things in order to stand a chance. Eventually you will get to the dome itself, although I find that to be a bit odd. There doesn't actually seem to be that many tokens flying about, no matter where I moved. Much like a lot of this game, even the final denouement feels rather off. The disappointing thing, most of all, is how little it feels like the Crystal Maze. The wide variation in difficulty certainly does give dedicated players a hefty task when it comes to mastering this title, and that could be of interest to folks, but sadly it doesn't do a lot to stir up the imagination. It feels a bit too generic, and a few more touches from the show would have gone a long way. Hell, even the BarQuest arcades, games that aren't exactly far removed from their famous slot machines, did a significantly better job of that. Mind you, I may have had a bit more of a feeling for this game if I'd come across it as a kid, whether it was in school or somewhere else. It is still the Crystal Maze, after all. This isn't a well-known game in the slightest. I can't imagine it did that well, and the reviews I can find range from a couple of more positive notes, mostly from Acorn-based mags, to some pretty brutal takedowns from the likes of PC Zone. Shurston were charging 40 quid for the game back when it was new, and while there is a bit of meat here with the difficulty and such, a lack of variety in the games and the not all that appealing aesthetic does let it down, and I would struggle to say that it holds a candle to the majority of puzzle games on PC, or a good chunk of the better known edutainment games back then, I'm afraid. Now there are a couple of other little things to cover, including some games that I'm not able to cover here. There have been a couple of Crystal Maze mobile games over the years, although none of them seem to be around anymore, and at least one of them is iOS only. I've only got Android here, I'm afraid. I believe that there's also another pub quiz type game based on the show from 2009, but again, I've not got any way of playing that here. Going back to the time of the show, BarQuest did release a more conventional Crystal Maze themed fruit machine back in the day, and Milton Bradley had a board game from the early 90s that was loosely based on the Crystal Maze, that comes with all sorts of very simple little mini-games and so on. I've never seen this myself, but reviews are not exactly complimentary. It does differ wildly from the original show in that players compete against each other rather than working as a team. Apparently the more recent board game that came out in 2018 for the revival of the Crystal Maze is a considerably better and more complex affair that's a lot more faithful to the show. There was also a line of puzzle and quiz books based on the Crystal Maze back in the early 90s, most of which were written by Peter Arnold, and most of which are aimed more at the children's market, particularly the Crystal Maze Mystery line of adventure puzzles. There is even, oh yes, a Crystal Maze LCD game by Grandstand, which appears to be as simple as you would expect. I found virtually nothing about this, but it is on the YouTube channel of one Phil Newton England, who is, according to Challenge TV, the world's #1 fan of the Crystal Maze, and what he doesn't know about the show probably isn't worth knowing. He's got lots of assorted maze-based ephemera on his channel, and there is a link in the description, as well as one to the Crystal Maze fan group, another brilliant resource. Now, for all that's been covered so far, I have been missing what is perhaps the most authentic and in-depth way of playing the Crystal Maze for yourself without going on the show. The one that, shockingly, involves leaving the computer behind and getting out there, going outside. Of course, I'm talking about escape rooms and physical attractions. As far as the maze goes, there are two things to cover here, one from the past and one from the present. Back in the 1990s, there were several Crystal Maze cyberdromes. 5 of them were dotted around the UK, in places like Blackpool, Oakwood and Tenby, but there were also 2 in Japan, near Nagoya and Yokohama, and another one in Dubai. Fans of the show apparently absolutely loved this. I can find a good few detailed accounts from people who went to the cyberdromes. From what I can gather, the Cyberdrome contained a mix of physical games as well as games that were played on terminals. A session would last around about 40 minutes or so, and the role of Maze Master was taken by a computerised figure called Merlin. The setup hits on all the main features of the show. You've got the thematic zones, doing challenges individually while your fellow team members shout helpful advice at you, lots of running about everywhere to find the games and terminals, and of course, the dome at the end where instead of picking up tokens that get blown about, you have to rush around and press golden buttons that flash on and off. Every account that I can find of the Cyberdrome says that it was tons of fun and really captured the feel of the show to a T, undoubtedly far more so than any of the much more simple games we've looked at. But while they were very popular for a time, interest did naturally wane in them after the Crystal Maze left TV screens, and slowly but surely they all closed their doors. It appears that the one in Dubai, of all places, was the last one to shut up shop. However, with trends being the way they are, someone was bound to try again. As escape rooms became very popular around the start of the 2010s, surely there was a gap in the market for someone to try their take on UK television's most famous original escape complex. And so, that's how you get the Crystal Maze live experience from Little Line. First opened in London's West End in 2016 after a very successful crowdfunding campaign, there's also a second location at the Old Granada Studios in Manchester. The experience lasts a bit over an hour, and well, the guys behind it did the simple thing, really. They loved the Crystal Maze, and so they went ahead and recreated it, even getting Richard O'Brien himself in to welcome teams with a video. Puzzles are accurate to the show, there's a dome at the end, a whole set of maze masters to guide each team through the challenge. Yeah, it's the bloody Crystal Maze alright, and generally people love the whole thing. I can find very few negative reviews for it at all. There's some cool YouTube videos documenting the whole thing. The almighty Tristabytes has got one, YouTube mega group The Sidemen went there, and the first one-off return of the Crystal Maze, the 2016 Stand Up to Cancer special hosted by Stephen Merchant, was filmed there. So there's plenty of vids out there where you can see it for yourself before going. It should be noted that Little Lion Entertainment are also responsible for the Tomb Raider live experience that opened up in Camden Stables Market last year. And with that, well, I think most of the zones in this video have been covered. While the Crystal Maze isn't currently on TV screens, whether in original or revived form, it still lives in some form or another, and nostalgia is always going to be very strong for it. The absolute anoraks of the game show form on the internet, UK game shows, have voted it the greatest British game show ever more than once, and it clearly deserves a place amongst the elite. For now though, it's time to put the harmonica down, make some tea, and have a chat with Mumsy. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and as ever, bye for now.